Hi, my name is Megan Jameson, and for my author presentation today, I will be talking about J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling very famously wrote Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone and the entire Harry Potter series. She was born in 1965 right outside of Bristol and left home at 18 to study at Exeter University, where, while she was a student, she traveled to Paris for a year. After she obtained her degree from Exeter, she did research at Amnesty International and then went to go teach English in Portugal, where she met her first husband, Jorge Orantes. She had a daughter with Jorge named Jessica, and then they were later divorced in 1993, and she went back to Edinburgh to teach in city schools. While she was teaching, every spare chance she got, she was writing, and by 1997, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was published in the UK. However, the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone was not published until 1998 in the United States. After that, she kept writing and wrote the rest of the series. It's a 7-book series that is very famous, and it has 8 movies that have been adapted by the Warner Brothers. And she also wrote books that appear in these books. The Tales of Beetle and Bard appear mainly in the Deathly Hallows, and then Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them and Quidditch Through the Ages are 2 other titles. Also, however, she wrote as Robert Galbraith, which is a pseudonym, and she wrote crime stories for adults. She also wrote The Casual Vacancy, which was published under her name as well. And finally, in 2016, with the help of Jack Thorne and John Tiffany, she helped co-write Harry Potter and the Cursed Child Parts 1 and 2, which was a prequel to Harry Potter. So, for my reading, I would like to read to you the first chapter of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to even think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing in with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull, gray Tuesday our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into the car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But, on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some new stupid fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and he was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed, open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, he made several important telephone calls, and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly, too. He couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in the bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters. That's right. That's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home phone number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Came to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her. If he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. Now that's not the end of the chapter. They're very long chapters, and they're books more suited for ages 3rd to 5th grade. I read them personally in 4th grade. But as a fun activity, what you can have the kids do is as the books progress, they have spells that come out. Leviosa, lumos, they tend to be old Latin words. And so what would be fun is to have the kids create a spell for themselves. One that's just fun and kind of silly, get them being creative. And then after they're done with their spells, take them outside and have them play Quidditch. Set up a couple soccer nets that are the small ones, have them be different point values and give them different size handballs. And then they have to throw them in and have somebody be the snitch. And then as they run around, if they get tagged by the seeker chosen by each team, that team receives the snitch, and it's an automatic win. That's just a fun idea to help tie the book into kind of everyday life, help get the kids active, and help get them creative. Those, of course, would be for 4th and 5th graders mainly. But I hope you enjoyed my presentation and know a little bit more about J.K. Rowling and her work with Harry Potter. Thank you.